Hello. Every time we interact with different government services, we've encountered a number of different terms: myGov, myGov ID, my ID, digital identity exchange, and so on. So if you're confused about these terms, like most of us are, I believe this presentation will bring in some clarity and hopefully demystify these different services. My name is Anil Shanbog, and let's have a look at AGDIS and myGov. So this presentation is divided into three sections: AGDIS, Australian Government Digital Identity System, and myGov. And then let's summarize what we've learned. So in the first section, let's look at AGDIS. So let's consider an imaginary scenario of visiting different attractions and see what are the risks and issues associated with it, and then what are the solutions, and see how this scenario maps to AGDIS. So assume that I want to visit these different attractions, say some wildlife zoo and sea life and tower eye and so on. So what are the different steps involved in visiting each of these? First, I need to find the address. I need to go to the address, and then I need to register with that attraction operator, and then I am issued some sort of pass, and hopefully let's assume that there's also a secret associated with it in terms of a pass key once I swipe the pass, and then I can get into the attraction and then enjoy it. So it's the same thing repeats over and over again. So if I want to visit, for example, 100 different attractions, so what really does that mean? That means I go to 100 different attractions, and then I have to register or obtain 100 different passes, and possibly 100 different secret keys associated with each of the passes. And every time I visit an attraction to register myself, I'm giving up some identity document of mine, maybe passport, Medicare, a card, a copy of it, and a driver's license, and additionally some personal information, my address, age, date of birth, license number, and so on. So what we're doing is we're creating all these different personal information stores ready for any malicious user to take advantage of. So because we can't be sure that these attraction operators are going to safeguard the personal information. And what's the solution for this? So let's say something called Berlin Pass, obviously like the Merlin Pass. Assume that instead of going to 100 different places and registering, I trust one of these Berlin Pass operators, which could be, for example, Woolworths, Westpac, or Australian Post. So assume that I can walk into Westpac, for example. If I trust Westpac, I walk into Westpac office, I provide them some documents, for example, my identity information in terms of my driver's license, and some address proof, and they issue me this Berlin Pass. Now using that Berlin Pass, I can go and visit n number of attractions that I'm interested in. So what really happened, what really changed now, is that I use the same pass at all the different attractions, and I'm obtaining the pass from a provider that I trust. So how does this change this entire scenario of visiting attractions now? The steps number 3 and 4 will change to something like this, where I just scan the same Berlin Pass across over and over again. And which means if I have different Berlin Pass providers, for example, this is a minor twist here. If I have Woolies, if I have Ozpost and Westpac providing me a pass, every time before I scan the pass, I have to tell the operator that I'm using a Berlin Pass issued by Woolworths or Westpac, and then enter the Berlin Pass password. So let's talk about how this whole scenario maps to Australian Government Digital ID system. So assume that these attractions that we discussed are the actual services. So just to recap what happened, I was interested in visiting these different 100 attractions. So instead of registering at each of these different places and providing my personal information, I go off to a provider that I trust, say for example Westpac, for instance, and then I give them some identity documents here, get issued a Berlin Pass, and then use that Berlin Pass at these different attractions. Every time I use the Berlin Pass, before I have to tell which Berlin Pass that I'm using. That's the Berlin provider selector. So I'm using a Berlin Pass issued by Westpac, or I'm using a Berlin Pass issued by Woolworths, for example. And then I enter my Berlin Pass secret, and then I'm inside the attraction. So this is the whole scenario that we've just cooked up. Now let's see how this maps to Australian Government Digital System, and see that these different attractions are the different services that I want to use. For example, maybe a service from Department of Defense or Department of Education or Employment, or could even be private sectors at some time in future. So which means I go to any of these attractions, any of these services. I don't have to register myself with Workforce Australia or Department of Defense or myGov and so on. what I can do instead is use the digital identity exchange to choose which identity provider. So that Berlin pass selector is actually the digital identity exchange, and these Berlin providers are nothing but our identity providers, which in this case is myGov ID, and any future identity providers that get onboarded. And this entire system is called the Australian Government Digital ID System. So once I register with Australia AGDIS and get a digital ID, I can reuse that digital ID across different online services. Could be private or public. Now, one thing to note is that myGov ID is the same as my ID. My ID being the new name, but essentially they're both one and the same. Let's have a look at what these services really look like. So I've pasted some screenshots here. So these are the different relying parties or the IT services that we want to access. In this instance, Workforce Australia or Department of Defense or something else, for example. And you see a button there, Continue Digital Identity. I click on it. I come into something called an identity exchange, which is displayed here, the screenshot, which lists out all these different identity providers that will be registered. Currently, my ID is the only one, but in the future there would be multiple options, private or government. Now I choose that identity provider which I believe in, and I'm taken off to that identity provider. That is where I authenticate, and then I come back to the identity exchange, which displays a consent screen saying that I'm going to share your first name, last name with Workforce Australia. Do you agree? And I say okay, I consent, and then the control goes back to Workforce Australia, and you're logged into here. So similarly, the same deal with all the other services. So what's the advantage here is that we are not registering again and again. We're not having to remember 100 different passwords which are specific to these services. And there's something called privacy preserving mechanism, which means these relying parties or the services do not know which identity provider you're using. Well, currently the my ID is the only one, so it's a bit of a strange situation. But in the future, when there are more than one identity providers, these relying parties will not know which identity provider you went to, whether you went to my ID or whether you went to Woolworths, for example, to prove yourself. Now let's look at what's myGov. So we've just talked about AGDIS. Let's go on and see what myGov is all about. So in the Berlin Pass system, let's continue with the example of visiting attractions. The Berlin Pass system addressed the issue of not having to register again and again and not having to remember 100 different usernames and password for each service. Now what are the other set of problems that we're looking at? So if I want to again continue on that example, if I want to visit 100 different attractions, I'm dealing with 100 different receptions at these attractions. So if I need to update my postal address, for example, I need to go to each and every attraction and then go to their reception of some sort and then update my new address. The other issue is that if I need to be notified about some event, some promotion, some new exhibit and so on, there's no single reception that I can get all my information at that's specific to me. Unfortunately, the way is I go to every single reception and then find out, okay, what are the new working hours, what are the new promotions, what are the new attractions and so on. So there's no single way to receive information and a single mechanism to transmit and updated information. And that's the kind of problem that we're trying to solve now. And the other issue is that finding these different addresses and then navigating to these different addresses is also a minor pain. So let's see how these steps 1, 2, 4 and 5 can be made better. Now let's continue on the imaginary scenario and see that how bringing Opera House into the picture makes a difference. So a user goes to Opera House, for instance. This is again imaginary scenario. A user goes to Opera House, and then from there, once they check into Opera House, they don't have to check in again at any of these different attractions. So Opera House assume that has all these different back doors. I just walk into the door and then I'm teleported to my attraction. So for argument's sake, now Opera House has a reception, and if I need to update my address, I just update it at Opera House reception, and then they can then send it away to an attraction of my choice to update the new address. Alternatively, if I want to receive some information from any of these different attractions, right now we are only seeing 3, assume that there were say 40-50 of them, then all of these receptions can send my specific information or information that is relevant to me to Opera House, and then I just go to the Opera House reception and then I can see all my information that's relevant to me. Now let's continue the same thing and see how this maps to myGov. This entire Opera House is myGov, and these different attractions that are connected to the Opera House are something called myGov member services. So Medicare, Centrelink, NDIS, and so on. So what does it really look like? This is a screenshot of myGov. So once I log into myGov, I have all these different services that I can then go off to. Remember the teleporting example where once I check into Opera House, I can teleport to any of these different attractions. This is a similar thing. So I'm logged into myGov. Once I'm logged in, I click on this. I am inside the authenticated space of ATO. If I click on this, I'm inside the authenticated space of Centrelink. I don't have to log in again. And the other big advantage is that there's a single inbox which collates all the information from each of the member services. So if Centrelink wants to send me an information, they send it off to myGov. If Medicare wants to send information to me, they send it off to myGov. I just log into a single inbox. I have access to all my information or communication there. So let's continue on and complete this picture. So there's these different attractions. Just to revisit what we've learned, there are these different attractions that I want to visit. So it could be 100 instead of re-registering at 100 different places and remembering 100 different passwords and handling 100 different passes. I go off to some providers of my choice, and then once I register with them, I get a pass issued. Every time I scan a pass, even before I scan a pass, I have to say which pass that I'm using. So that's something called the Berlin provider selector. So once I select that I'm using Woolworths pass, then I can use the Woolworths Berlin pass and consistently enter each of these different attractions without having to register again and again or carry different passes. Now this entire system, the Berlin system that we saw earlier, and then remember the Sydney Opera House was a special attraction which had all these back doors to go away to any of these member attractions of Sydney Opera House. And the other thing was, if I needed any communication, Sydney Opera House would collate all the communication from all these different attractions, and if I need to update my address, I only update it at Sydney Opera House, which then sends away my updated address to these other member services, member attractions. So this whole system, this whole picture that we saw in terms of an attraction example maps exactly to AGDIS and myGov. So these are all these different IT services that I want to access. So in order to avoid registering at each of these services, I go and register at a single service called myID or Identity Exchange, get a digital identity. This entire thing is AGDIS or digital identity. I go and get a digital identity. Once I have a digital identity, I can use the same digital ID or my digital identity at any of these different participating services. Now myGov was the special member service or the special relying party which had connection to all these other myGov member services, which is Medicare, Centrelink, NDIS, and so on. So what does myGov do? If I need to update my address, I only update it at myGov, something called a tell us once concept. So I update it to myGov, and then myGov then sends away that information. Additionally, myGov also collates information that's relevant to me from all of these other member services. So in myGov inbox, I can see all the emails corresponding to all the other IT services that are relevant for me. So on one side, AGDIS solves the problem of logging in and not having to register 100 different places, not having to remember 100 different passwords. That's the problem that AGDIS is solving. myGov is like a front door to the government services. So from myGov, I can then branch off to any of these member services. myGov, I can tell the services once instead of having to go and update my address at all of these places. I just update it at a single place, which means it's a mechanism of updating my information, and it's a mechanism of collating my information. So if any of these other member services want to send some information to me, I can access it in a central place. So that's the two different service offerings from Australian government, the AGDIS and myGov, and this completes the picture. These are some references that you can have a look at, and I'm not officially, there's not any official communication from any government agency, and this is information purposes only. And if you need to have this presentation, please reach out to me on LinkedIn. Thank you.